The rag in her hand was soaked with lemon-scented water, but her dreams smelled like lavender and hope. She scrubbed floors so clean you could see your own broken past in them. But the mansion she mopped today wasn't just another house. It was a palace built on power, marble, and a man no one ever saw. And yet, as she dragged the mop across his world of gold and glass, a shadow shifted silently in the top-floor window. He was watching. Her name was Grace, 26, blonde hair tied in a knot so tight you could see the stress lines carved into her forehead. She hadn't always been a cleaner. Once, she'd studied interior design, believed in art, painted birds on the ceilings of children's rooms. But life doesn't care about colors when bills scream louder than beauty. So she packed up her dreams and found herself cleaning other people's art, mopping up the footprints of a life she could never afford. The mansion belonged to Victor Langston, a man the city worshipped and feared in equal measure. Billionaire by 35, built empires, broke records, burned bridges. No one ever saw him in person anymore. Just rumors of his loneliness echoing in luxury halls. His staff had never met him. Orders came through assistants. Rooms were cleaned, food delivered, lawns trimmed. But the man himself was always a ghost. Except today, something was different. Grace felt it. The silence wasn't just silence, it was breathless. She arrived just after dawn, when the morning light still spilled through the mansion like liquid silver. The entrance alone was big enough to house 5 families. She moved quickly, discreet, invisible. That was her gift. She knew how to disappear in plain sight. But in the east wing, past the indoor pool and the antique globe room, she paused. There was a faint sound, like someone exhaling, slowly, above her. She looked up. Nothing, just chandeliers and cathedral ceilings. But Grace had grown up trusting her instincts, and her skin prickled with attention. Still, she worked. She scrubbed around the pillars. She polished the baseboards. She folded the blankets on chairs that hadn't been sat in for years. And every so often, she caught her own reflection in the shiny floor. Her eyes hollow, her body tired, her hands red from chemicals. But she kept going. Because today's shift paid double. Because she needed new shoes for her little brother. Because you can't cry into a bucket and expect it to fill with anything but dirty water. Meanwhile, 2 floors above, Victor watched. He hadn't meant to. He was pacing, restless again, another sleepless night followed by another empty morning. He drank his black coffee from a crystal tumbler, staring at a ledger he didn't care about. Numbers came easy, people did not. And yet, when he glanced through the camera feed, just a test of his upgraded security system, he saw her. A woman with the posture of pain and the grace of someone who'd been knocked down and refused to stay there. He leaned closer. No one had caught his attention like that in years. He watched as she adjusted a flower vase she didn't have to touch, how she picked up a fallen earring and placed it gently on the dresser, how she whispered something to herself while wiping a window, maybe a prayer or a memory. She didn't know he was there. And somehow, that made every movement more honest than anything he'd seen in boardrooms or ballrooms. Grace didn't know her every step was being studied. She didn't know the man who owned the empire had just ignored a dozen emails to watch her pick lint from a velvet chair. She didn't know that while she mopped the floor with calloused fingers, a billionaire with ice in his veins suddenly felt warmth behind his ribs. As the day slipped by, she finished the last room. Her clothes were damp, her shoes squeaked, her stomach ached for food she couldn't afford. But she smiled faintly as she closed her cleaning kit. Another job done. Another floor that would shine, even if her own future didn't. She turned toward the exit, but Victor didn't move. He just stood by the window, frozen. Not because she left something behind, but because she had left something inside him. And for the first time in years, the richest man in the city didn't feel like the one in control. The first raindrop tapped the glass like a whisper. Then came another, and another. By the time Grace stepped into the front hall, the skies had turned the color of wet charcoal, and the wind howled like a warning through the trees. She wrapped her arms around herself, glancing out at the twisting storm. The estate's front gates, once clear in the distance, were now swallowed by mist. Her ride back hadn't arrived. No signal, no service, only thunder. She turned, unsure what to do. No one ever told her the rules for staying past her shift, and certainly not in a place like this. But as lightning tore the sky, illuminating the endless lawn like a stage, she knew one thing: she couldn't leave. Not yet. Not like this. She stayed by the large marble pillar near the entry, unsure whether to sit, call again, or hide. But somewhere deep in the mansion's upper levels, a silent choice had already been made. Victor saw it all from his quiet office nook. The cameras showed her hesitation, her helplessness in the storm. She could have been anyone, just another cleaner, another name forgotten. But the way she stood still, waiting with poise rather than panic, stirred something. So he made a decision no billionaire had made in that house in years. He pressed the button for the guest wing heater. He dimmed the chandeliers, and he had his assistant, from far off sight, activate the pantry access. No messages, no instructions, just silent, quiet hospitality. Grace felt the warmth trickle in like a gentle hug. A vent above began humming. Then, in the corner of the hallway, a soft chime, like a door unlocking. Curious, she tiptoed toward the pantry. The knob gave way easily. Inside was a sight that nearly made her cry: bread, tea, fruit, soup in warmers. Her hands trembled as she touched a mug. This wasn't normal. Someone knew she was here, and someone cared enough to offer comfort. She ate slowly, her body shivering, not from cold now, but from something else: being seen. For the first time in months, she wasn't just cleaning up after the rich. She was being treated as if she mattered, as if her presence didn't need to be erased before dawn. She sat at the edge of the long hallway bench, chewing quietly, and occasionally glancing around, wondering, unsure. Upstairs, Victor turned away from the screen. His heart beat strangely in his chest. All his life, he'd bought power, protected it, isolated it. But no amount of money had ever softened his world. Until now. Until the woman with dishwater on her shirt and tired beauty in her eyes took refuge under his roof and didn't even know she was in his world. He watched her sleep against the velvet cushion, her breath steady, her fingers curled. She looked like someone used to being alone, but tonight she wasn't. The storm raged outside, battering the windows and shaking the foundation. Grace didn't hear it anymore. Wrapped in a borrowed throw blanket and warmed by a house that had never been kind to people like her, she drifted into sleep. Safe, sheltered, still unaware of the eyes that had followed her all day. By morning, the sky was painted gold, and birds were already testing the branches. Grace stirred. Embarrassed, she rose quickly, folded the blanket, wiped the tears she didn't remember crying, and prepared to leave. But just before she reached the front door, she saw it. A note, folded, neatly placed on the side table where she had left her cleaning bucket the day before. It read, "Take today off. Full pay. Thank you for your kindness to a home that forgot how to be kind." No name, no signature, just that. Grace blinked twice. Her breath caught. Someone had been there. Someone had watched. And someone had cared. She stepped outside, her heart heavier than it should have been. Because in a house built on silence and wealth, something had spoken to her louder than words, and she didn't know it yet. But that note wasn't the end. It was the invitation. Victor Langston had seen hundreds of people walk through his mansion. Chefs with white hats, landscapers with hedge clippers, architects with blueprints and perfect smiles. But not one of them had left behind anything that lingered. Not in the air, Not in the walls, not in the silence. Until Grace. She had walked in with a mop and bucket, yet somehow walked out having rearranged the atmosphere of his home. He could still see the spot where she slept curled up under the staircase, could still feel the warmth she left on the cushion. It haunted him, but in a way that soothed. The note he'd left wasn't just a gesture. It was an experiment. He wanted to see if she'd come back. Not for the job, but for the house. For what it offered that she didn't yet understand. For what he didn't yet understand himself. And she did. 2 days later, Grace returned. Same uniform, same knot in her hair. But something was different in her eyes. Not lighter, but steadier. Like she had been noticed, and now carried the invisible proof of it with her. She stepped in with hesitation, wondering if she should act normal, wondering if the note had been a one-time kindness or the beginning of something. Either way, she swept and scrubbed with her usual care, but this time she paused more often. She looked at the walls differently. She checked for more notes. None came. Victor watched. Of course he did, but this time he didn't stay hidden behind screens. He walked the halls, quiet, distant, observing her not like a ghost, but like a man unsure whether he wanted to be seen. He stood behind pillars. He listened to the faint hum she made while wiping down mirrors. He noticed the way she smoothed out the rugs, even when no one would walk on them. And more than once, he reached for the doorknob to step into her view, only to retreat. Because the man with money enough to buy countries was afraid of being seen by the one woman who hadn't even tried to see him. But then something happened he hadn't planned for. She found the painting. In the west corridor, a place rarely cleaned because no guests ever saw it, Grace stumbled upon an old oil canvas, dust-covered, crooked, forgotten. It was a portrait of a woman, smiling, holding a small boy's hand. The boy was no older than 7. The frame was cracked. The colors had faded. But Grace's eyes softened the second she touched it. She gently dusted the surface, wiped around the edges with her sleeve, and whispered something under her breath. She didn't know whose it was, but she treated it like it mattered. And when she lifted the frame to straighten it, a small card dropped from behind. Yellowed, folded, torn, but intact. Victor, who had just turned the corner, stopped. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. That card had been hidden for over 2 decades. It was the last letter his mother ever wrote to him, tucked behind the only picture that made him feel safe as a child. And Grace was holding it as though it were made of glass. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't even read it at all. She just looked at it, noticed the initials, and placed it back carefully behind the frame. Then, with reverence, she adjusted the painting to hang straight and stood back as if she were saluting a memory not her own. Victor stepped back into the shadows. He couldn't explain the ache in his throat. She hadn't stolen. She hadn't pried. She had simply honored something. And in that moment, he knew. Grace didn't just clean floors. She restored dignity. When she left that evening, her footsteps echoing down the marble steps, Victor stayed in the corridor long after. He ran his hand over the frame. He touched the note. And then, for the first time since he built that mansion, he sat down in the hallway and stared at the past, not to mourn it, but because someone had reminded him that it still mattered. It was nothing expensive, not even silver, just a small worn chain with a wooden charm shaped like a lily, Grace's mother's favorite flower. It had been hand-carved by her younger brother the year their mother passed. It wasn't worth anything to the world, but it was everything to her. She wore it under her uniform, tucked close to her chest, hidden beneath the fabric, her invisible armor, until the day it vanished. That morning had started like any other. Grace showed up early. Her hands worked without needing her thoughts. She polished, folded, wiped, and dusted, lost in the rhythm of repetition. But sometime between the west staircase and the upstairs sitting room, her fingers brushed her collarbone and felt nothing. Her heart dropped. She checked her pockets, retraced her steps, scoured every surface she'd touched. Nothing. Panic rose like fire. Her breath quickened. She dropped to her knees and checked under every rug, every chair leg, every crack in the marble. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. The house was too big, too many rooms, too many places it could have fallen into and never be seen again. From his study, Victor saw her distress before she realized she was being watched. The cameras showed her crawling across the floor, not cleaning, but searching. And when he zoomed in, he noticed something he had never seen before in all her shifts: desperation. She wasn't just a worker looking for a misplaced tool. This was deeper, personal. He didn't hesitate. For the first time in years, he pressed the emergency staff recall button. The assistants thought it was a malfunction. But within minutes, the mansion's head of security was in his office. Victor spoke few words. A necklace, small, wooden charm. Find it. No one leaves until it's returned. Downstairs, Grace had almost given up. Her knees were bruised. Her pride was thin. She sat on the bottom step of the marble staircase and covered her face. She wasn't crying, but she was close. Then a man in a dark suit approached her. Soft-voiced, respectful. He handed her a small velvet pouch and said, "Someone thought this might belong to you." She opened it, and there it was. Her necklace, safe, undamaged, and warm from someone's hand. She clutched it, pressing it to her chest. "How did—" she whispered. But the man was already gone. She looked around. The hallway was still. The lights glowed faintly. The camera above blinked red. Someone had seen her. And more than that, someone had cared enough to act. Upstairs, Victor watched her reaction. Not from pride, but from something far more vulnerable. In all his life, he had used power to control, to influence, to dominate. But today, for the first time, he used it to protect. Later that night, when she had left, and the house fell into its usual hush, Victor walked down to the staircase where she had sat. He looked around, not at the gold-framed art or the priceless statues, but at the simple imprint her body had left on the cushion. He knelt, touched the place where she had clutched her necklace, and for the first time allowed himself to whisper her name. Grace. It felt strange in his mouth, not because of her status, not because of what she did, but because she was the only one who had ever entered his fortress and left it more alive than she found it. He stood and turned toward the west wing. There was a decision forming in him, one he wasn't sure he had the right to make. But if Grace came back one more time, he wouldn't hide anymore. The request came through her cleaning agency like any other. Grace was to report directly to the Langston Mansion's north wing at 8 a.m. sharp. No explanation, no added pay rate, no mention of additional tasks, just a room number. The library. It unsettled her. She had never been asked to clean a specific room. The instructions had always been vague, general, distant, like the man who owned the house. But this was different, personal, intentional, and it made her heart race for reasons she didn't understand. She arrived early, wearing the same uniform, the same plain shoes, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her supplies. She crossed the entryway, passed through the grand hall, and arrived at the double doors of the library, a place she had never been allowed into before. She pushed the heavy door open. What she saw stopped her mid-step. The library was unlike any other room in the mansion. Dark oak walls stretched to the ceiling. Thousands of books lined the shelves like ancient soldiers guarding secrets. A fire crackled quietly in the stone hearth, and in the center of the room, beside a tall window where morning light filtered through sheer curtains, sat a man. Not a shadow, not a myth, a man. Victor Langston. Grace froze. The mop slipped from her grip and clattered softly against the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just looked at her, not with the cold stare of the rich, but with the unsure gaze of someone who had waited too long to be seen. Grace swallowed hard. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to run. She wanted to know why the most powerful man in the city was sitting in silence while a cleaner stood in his presence. But then he did something that no one expected. He stood up, slowly, calmly, walked to the side table and picked up something small. When he turned back, he held out a simple bouquet. Wildflowers, not roses, not lilies from a florist, but hand-picked, uneven, and real. He set them down on the chair closest to her, then walked away. No words, no smile, no commands, just a gesture. And then he left the room. Grace remained standing for what felt like hours. The flowers stared up at her like a riddle. Everything about that moment rewrote her understanding of the mansion, the man, and maybe even herself. She walked over, touched the petals, and found a card tucked beneath the ribbon. It read, "For the one who cleans with grace and leaves behind more beauty than she finds." No signature, but none was needed. Grace's heart thudded against her ribs like a drum. She picked up the mop again, but not to clean. She placed it gently beside the bookshelf, sat on the velvet armchair, and just breathed. And somewhere far down the hall, Victor stood outside the room he'd never let anyone into before, his hands shaking, his mind loud with thoughts he couldn't voice. For a moment, they were just two people in the same world. Not a billionaire, not a maid, just a man and a woman sharing silence. And that silence spoke volumes. In Part 6, the mansion that had once stood cold becomes a place of unexpected beginnings, and Grace discovers a secret that will change both their lives forever. Would you like me to continue with the final part? Grace returned the next day and the day after, each time carrying more questions than cleaning supplies. The mansion no longer felt like a place to work. It felt like a story slowly unfolding, page by page. Victor never appeared again in full view, but the signs of him were everywhere now. A second chair placed near a window, a teacup with 2 sugars, already set beside her mop bucket. Fresh flowers, different each time, all anonymous, all intentional. And then came the key. It was waiting for her on the edge of the west hallway table, next to the same velvet pouch that once held her lost necklace. The tag read, "East Wing, Last Door." That part of the house had always been locked. Even security avoided it. Whispers said it was the late Mrs. Langston's private quarters. Untouched, preserved like a shrine. Grace stood there, heart pounding, fingers trembling, unsure whether to enter or run. She turned the key. The door creaked open into a world trapped in time. The air was heavy with lavender and memory. Photographs lined the walls, soft, faded images of a young Victor beside a smiling woman. A piano stood in the corner, still tuned, and by the window a canvas sat on an easel, half-painted, unfinished, as though someone had been interrupted mid-stroke. On the writing desk was a final letter, handwritten, folded, addressed not to Grace by name but simply to the one who brought life back to these halls. She sat and read. "I built this house to escape the world. I filled it with art to hide my absence, but none of it made me feel whole again after losing her. I stopped inviting people in. I stopped being a man, until the day I saw someone clean my home like it mattered, and treat it as if it still had a soul. You didn't know I was watching. That's what made it real. If you ever wish to leave mops behind and walk with me into something unknown, the West Garden Gate will be open at sunset. No cameras, no guards, just me. V." Grace folded the letter. The air felt different now, like the mansion had exhaled after years of holding its breath. That evening, she stood at the West Garden Gate. The sky was awash of gold and quiet clouds. The path beyond the gate led to the cliffs, where the ocean waited like a patient witness. Victor was there, alone. No suit, No shield. He didn't speak when he saw her. He only nodded, as if to say, "I hoped you'd come." She didn't answer aloud. She simply walked forward and stood beside him. For the first time in years, the mansion behind them wasn't just made of stone and wealth. It was a home again. And Grace, the woman who once scrubbed its floors, now stood at its threshold not as a cleaner, but as the one who cleaned its heart.